Good afternoon and welcome everybody to today's virtual program. My name is Andrew Gustafson. I'm with Turnstile Tours, and we are so happy to be presenting this program today in partnership with our friends at Friends of Olmsted-Beil House. And we have a very exciting and very knowledgeable guest who's going to be telling us about the life and work of Frederick Law Olmsted and his connections to Staten Island. So thank you so much for joining us. But I want to introduce first the hosts of our program, Friends of Olmsted-Beil House, and I want to introduce the Vice President, Bill Bell, who's going to be introducing our speaker and telling us a little bit about their organization.
Good afternoon. I want to welcome you to this program, Frederick Law Olmsted, designer of America and his Staten Island roots. Before I introduce this afternoon's speaker, I wanted to say a few words about Friends of Olmsted-Beil House, the sponsor of today's program. It is an all-volunteer, nonprofit 501c3 organization whose mission is to protect, preserve, and present the Olmsted-Beil House. For those of you who may not know it, the house is a large farmhouse, parts of which date to 1685, making it one of the oldest existing buildings in New York City. Almost 200 years after its first construction, from 1848 to 1855, it was the home of Frederick Law Olmsted. The house is a New York City landmark and is now listed on both the New York State and federal registers of historic places. It's located in Eltingville, Staten Island on the South Shore. When Olmsted lived in the house, it was part of a 130-acre farm. It was on this farm that Olmsted experimented with and developed ideas and worked with plants and trees not native to the area, like Osage oranges, ginkgos, and cedars of Lebanon. Examples of those trees that Olmsted planted, still stand in the park, which is now reduced to about an acre and a half. It ran from the shores of Raritan Bay on the south to the Amboy Road on the north. This year, 2022, has been an important year for Olmsted. Under the auspices of the National Association for Olmsted Parks, a year-long celebration was organized across the country to commemorate the 200th anniversary of Olmsted's birth on April 26, 1822. Olmsted's legacy as a landscape architect, as you will hear from our speaker, extends across the entire country. Those landscapes and parks, famous and obscure, owe much in how they look and function to the work, thinking, and connections made by Olmsted while at the farm he called Tosomock on Staten Island. But it wasn't only the field of landscape architecture, which he essentially founded, that got its start on Staten Island. His journalism, his democratic, small d, philosophy, his passion for social reform and public health all derive significant lifts from his time and connections he made during his years on Staten Island. There's probably no one better than today's speaker to tie all these threads together and show the origin of Olmsted's ideas and the legacy that he left in parks, public lands, natural scenery, as well as the light his journalism and writings shone on the issues of his day, some of which are still with us in our current time. Laurence Cotton, originally from Boston, where Olmsted's emerald necklace draws thousands of visitors, is now based in Portland, Oregon. He might be best known as the consulting producer and primary researcher for the PBS special, Frederick Law Olmsted, Designing America. Laurence is an acclaimed public historian who has delivered talks on Olmsted across the country. Laurence has conducted extensive research into the life and legacy of Olmsted, visiting sites from the East Coast to the West Coast. For today's program, Laurence will present the remarkable life and career of the Renaissance-man Olmsted, writer, philosopher, social reformer, advocate for the preservation of natural scenery, and creator of some of the most beautiful public and private parks and gardens in all of North America. Laurence will also take us on a visual tour of representative masterful landscapes designed by Olmsted Sr., as well as his two sons and the Olmsted brothers landscape architecture firm, as the footprint of their works literally stretch across the entire continent. So to begin the tour, I would now turn to Laurence and turn the microphone over to him. Thank you.
Well, thank you, everyone, and good afternoon to all of you. Let me, here we go, folks. So it's a pleasure to join all of you today. Thanks you very much for the introduction, Andrew and Bill. It's good to know that there are so many people with us today who are clearly interested in the name Olmsted. It's truly an honor to present to an audience gathered here today by Friends of Olmsted-Beil House and Turnstile Tours. I want to extend my thanks to everyone associated with the Friends of Olmsted-Beil House who have made this event possible, in particular, of course, William Bell, who has put so much time into planning for this program. I've only made a passing visit to Olmsted-Beil House once, in fact, many years ago. I realized that its preservation and restoration, its protection, is a work of progress. I do want to acknowledge the care and attention given to this historic property by its keepers, so to speak, including, of course, the successful efforts to secure its listings on historic registers, and also a notable event that occurred last summer that I'll refer to at the end of my program. Before I go any further, as you've already heard, April 26, 2022, well, now my slides aren't advancing. There we go. Okay. April 26, 2022 marked the 200th birthday of Frederick Law Olmsted's communities. Across the US, we're preparing for this past spring. In fact, they've been preparing for this entire calendar year of 2022 to commemorate the legacy of all the Olmsteds, father, two sons, and the Olmsted Brothers landscape architecture firm. This is how you can learn about Olmsted 200. My plan is this in the time that remains. I will review Olmsted's life and career. Then we will explore the Olmsted legacy across North America, including senior, but also here at the end of this 200 year, it's important to spend more time focusing on the legacy of the two sons and the Olmsted Brothers firm across North America. Then towards the end, I will focus in on the region, New York State, Connecticut, Long Island, a bit into New Jersey. And of course, I will incorporate some touchstones of Olmsted's duration on Staten Island throughout at Tosomock Farm throughout this program. Well, allow me to reintroduce, if you will, not just the man of the day, but the man of the year, Frederick Law Olmsted. Here is a colorful description of the man by his friend, George Templeton Strong, a well-known public figure and diarist of the day. This is taken directly from Templeton Strong's diary. He is an extraordinary fellow, decidedly the most remarkable specimen of human nature with whom I've ever been brought into close relationship. Talent and energy the most rare. Absolute purity and disinterestedness, prominent defects, a monomania for system and organization. He works like a dog all day and sits up nearly all night, doesn't go home to his family for 5 days together, works with steady, feverish intensity until 4 in the morning, sleeps on a sofa in his clothes, and breakfasts on strong coffee and pickles. Well, I don't know about you, ladies and gentlemen out there. I have been known to breakfast on strong coffee as I did at 6 a.m. this morning, but strong pickles at that hour do not appeal. Well, here is Frederick himself reminiscing on his boyhood. I was very active, imaginative, inventive, impulsive, enterprising, trustful, and heedless, a troublesome and mischievous boy. I was nominally the pupil of a topographical engineer, but really for the most part given over to a decently restrained vagabond life, generally pursued under the guise of an angler, a fowler, or a dabbler on the shallowest shores of the deep sea of the natural sciences. Well, that mischievous boy turned vagabond certainly eventually made something of his life, did he not? And I hope you come away from today's program with a more enhanced feel for this man and what made him tick and the legacy that he and his sons bequeathed to our nation. Central Park, Brooklyn's Prospect Park, there's the Long Meadow, Boston's Emerald Necklace, the White City of the Chicago World's Fair, the park systems of Buffalo, perhaps the most well-known of those parks being Delaware Park. Same thing here in Louisville, an entire park system, perhaps the best known being Cherokee Park. Also parks in the city of Chicago, remnants of which are from the World Columbian Exposition. Here's the Japanese Garden inside Jackson Park. I shouldn't use the term remnant. It's a sizable park system to this day. Also Belle Isle in Detroit, a beautiful lake in the Detroit River, a wonderful amenity for the city of Detroit. Olmsted Linear Park in Druid Hills, Atlanta. The Biltmore Estate, we cannot forget, in Asheville, North Carolina, the US Capitol grounds. Riverside, Illinois, one of the first intentionally planned, master planned green garden suburbs in the United States, Mount Royal Park in Montreal, and the Niagara Falls State Reservation on the New York side of the waterfall complex. Those are just a handful of the more celebrated masterful landscapes designed by Frederick Law Olmsted Sr. But if you add in the park designs and landscapes carried out by his two sons and the Olmsted brothers firm, the imprint across the geography of North America is simply astounding. 700 public parks and 6,000 commissions in the life of the Olmsted brothers firm that was active in Brookline, Massachusetts until the 1970s. Before I go further, I want to share a few items from media coverage in the past several years that'll be particularly of interest to those who live in the New York area. Perhaps some of you read this column a few years ago in the New York Review of Books, an article titled America's Green Giant. No, we're not talking about that funny looking fellow who sold green peas. We're talking about Mr. Olmsted. In fact, the reviewer who wrote this column, Martin Filler, was discussing several volumes by and about Olmsted, including this collection of essays that I commend to you. After initially calling attention to the acclaim that has been received by the High Line Linear Park along Manhattan's West Side, Filler writes this, quote, "Yet however much the High Line has enriched the post-millennial megalopolis, its social effects pale in comparison to the revolutionary vision of the public park as promulgated by its greatest American exponent, the 19th century polymath, Frederick Law Olmsted." I expect some of you read this a year and a half ago in the pages of the New York Times, COVID winter 2021, a moving essay by Michiko Kakutani, who was in fact an avid bird watcher. The heading was Finding Refuge and a Snowy Owl in Central Park. So first we have to start with a perfect image of Central Park in winter. This is but an extract of a longer piece of hers. Quote, "Central Park has long provided a refuge from the anxieties and stresses of daily life, perhaps never more so than during the coronavirus. New Yorkers who visited the park every day, as well as those who had long taken it for granted, felt a renewed love for this amazing rectangle of green in the heart of the big city. Its startlingly lush woodlands and rolling lawns, its meandering trails and wide open meadows, and of course, its astonishing wildlife, including owls. Here is the very snowy owl, including owls, hawks, herons, and a dizzying array of other birds who for generations have used Central Park as a vital rest stop in their migratory travels. Knowing what many humans only came to fully appreciate during the uncertainties of the pandemic, that the park is a beautiful and essential sanctuary." Thank you, Michiko. So perfectly stated. And by the way, if I had written that, the only difference that I would have applied is I would have bolded the word essential sanctuary. Just to give you a sense of the path that brought me to this film project, when I was young, I would visit the house of my maternal grandparents, very near Boston's Franklin Park. As an adult, I would regularly walk along Olmsted's Back Bay Fens and Fenway to visit the famous museums, the Museum of Fine Arts and the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum that are right there along the Fenway. I would jog around Jamaica Pond and botanize and stroll around the Olmsted-designed Harvard Arnold Arboretum. All of those parks are integrated into Boston's famed Emerald Necklace, a crescent of Olmsted-designed parks and parkways that wind around a major portion of the city. Of course, I would also visit Central Park. And eventually, not until my mid-20s, did I come across Prospect Park in Brooklyn. In fact, the first time I entered through Endale Arch and looked down the expanse of the Long Meadow in Prospect Park, tears welled up in my eyes as I was overwhelmed by its sheer beauty and utter perfection. This was decades before I had a notion of making a film about this gentleman named Frederick Law Olmsted. In fact, speaking of which, I expect some in our audience today saw our film. This is the original PBS film, Frederick Law Olmsted Designing America. Perhaps you caught the PBS broadcast. Perhaps you managed to locate it on PBS or watched it on Amazon Prime or YouTube. I learned very shortly, by the way, after moving to Portland, Oregon, some 28 years ago, that the entire park system where I speak to you now, in fact, I'm speaking from virtually an Olmsted Park in Portland called Laurelhurst Park, and that the entire park system here, in fact, was master planned by another Olmsted, the stepson, John Charles. And I began to ponder on this topic. And about 15, 16 years ago, after completion of a prior film, thinking about what would be next, I began to research deeply into the Olmsted scholarship, the biographies and other scholarship on landscape history and landscape architecture. And before long, I approached an old friend back in Massachusetts. I have to give him credit here, Larry Hott, a co-founder of Florentine Films with Ken Burns. And I said to Larry, it's about time we collaborated and let's produce a film for public television. Well, it did take about 7 years, but finally it did air nationwide on 2014. Now, since that time, this film is easily viewable online, so I've developed this always ever changing, ever evolving, ever improving, iterative PowerPoint presentation, if you will. But during that time, as I've continued to present this across America, I've dug yet further into the archives, into the scholarship, met with practitioners, and revisited some of my favorite Olmsted landscapes, but also I'm always visiting new ones along the way. There's ever new ones that are worth visiting. And it's been quite the experience. So allow me in the time that remains to summarize some of the salient content of the film and to expand it upon a little and to share some of my gleanings with you. So rather than reviewing Olmsted's entire career in this program, what I want to simply do is launch him on his career trajectory and hint at some of the stops along the curvilinear path, if you will, that caused him to become America's great park maker. His early years in brief. And this will be a repetition for many of you who've attended these programs, but we'll get to some fresh material. His life, Frederick Law Olmsted's life began in 1822 as the son of this gentleman, the first son of successful merchant John Olmsted in Hartford, Connecticut. As a youth, young Olmsted roamed his native Connecticut landscape on his father's saddle on horseback through this beautiful countryside in silent, contemplative, reverie-filled trips, absorbing in the multidimensional scenery. Young Frederick attended several boarding schools in Connecticut, but he had to abandon plans for college due to weak eyesight. He did work briefly for a New York City dry goods importing firm, but the young man was captured by the romance of life at sea. And in 1843, he set off for China as an apprentice seaman. Thus, Fred Olmsted had his year before the mast, if you will, as a seaman sailing to China and back. And as you read about it in the biographies, by the way, it was a harrowing experience. Now, Fred Olmsted did attend lectures at Yale, but it was actually his brother, his beloved younger brother, John Hull Olmsted, who was matriculated at Yale, who was enrolled. Frederick basically audited his brothers and other classes there, including classes on chemistry and scientific agriculture, among others. But he did during this time hang out with a whole group of Yaleys, if I can use that term. And here is a photo of Olmsted with some of his brother and his chums. I do want to point out, here's his brother up top. Here is Frederick, bottom right. And he has his right arm around this interesting fellow, staring very intently out at all of us out of the center of the screen. That's Charles Loring Brace, who will go on to found the Children's Aid Society in New York and become one of the leading social reformers of the day. And by the way, a lifelong, not just a lifelong friend, but a lifelong influence on Frederick Law. In 1846, Olmsted began to explore as a career, in fact, as a scientific farmer, a field that was on the rise. First, he apprenticed at a model farm near Syracuse, New York. Then, with his father's financial assistance, he farms first on the Connecticut shore near Guilford at a place called Sacham's Head, but he gives up that property in short order. It doesn't turn out to be so suitable for farming. Subsequently, he buys a larger property on Staten Island that you all know so well, Tosomock Farm. There is I believe it's an early 20th century black and white photograph above. It's not dated. And here is Olmsted's original sketch, which all of you know so well, down below. And while visiting Staten Island, by the way, here's an enlarged version of the sketch. We'll leave it up for a while. While visiting Staten Island, in fact, Olmsted's father had seen Tosomock Farm earlier. Situated near the southern shore of the island, it was closer to New York City. And in 1848, Fred's father loaned his son $12,000 for the purchase. The 140-acre property had splendid views of the waterfront between the island and the Atlantic, and had a livelier community and was closer to his brother and friends. The new farm was more agreeable to Olmsted's future plans than the prior site in Connecticut. Its old Dutch stone farmhouse and surroundings also suited the new farmer. The site had been in use, by the way, as a wheat farm since the late 17th century. With his brother John Hull embarking on a medical career and many Yale friends still nearby, the Staten Island farm, Tosomock, also known as Southside, soon became a weekend gathering spot. Neighbors came to call, or they invited this new young farmer to dinner. One was Dr. Cyrus Perkins, by the way, a retired medical professor, who gave Frederick 4 grapevines from his Holly farm. He also introduced his granddaughter, Mary Perkins, who had come to live with him after the death of her parents, and a friendship soon blossomed between her and the younger brother, John Hull Olmsted, that will, of course, eventually consummate in a marriage. At this time, by the way, Olmsted starts experimenting with new drainage techniques, some of which he learns about in a trip that's about to start in England. He moves a great deal of earth while there at Tosomock Farm. He repositions outbuildings. He plants a considerable number of trees, as you heard, in particular with an emphasis on fruit trees and nut trees. He also hones his technical and design skills, creating a dramatic curved driveway, draining marshes to increase usable acreage, and adding water plants to the utilitarian barnyard pond to improve the scene. By the early months of the 1850, spurred by the engagement of John Hull and Miss Perkins, the families drew closer together. Eager for one last overseas adventure before settling down and hoping to improve his health, John Hull and his friend Charles Loring Brace planned a walking trip through England. Caught off guard, Frederick wrote his father for help in joining his brother abroad, and Father Olmsted, of course, agreed, and the three young men set sail for England on April 30th, 1850. Frederick brought his notebook, intending to write about his travels and learn from farmers abroad and the craft and crops of farming there. The ship docked near Liverpool in early May, high springtime in England. Learning as much from the English country landscape surrounding each farm and village as from his interviews with local farmers. Olmsted would incorporate this into what would result in a book, of course. The trio explored the English landscapes from Liverpool to London with the visual inspiration for a lifetime of landscape design. And in fact, upon returning from this adventure, Olmsted published a travelogue and a reflective series of essays in this volume, Walks and Talks of an American Farmer of England, his very first publication. There's the original, a version of the original on your left. You can buy that very edition that you see on your right. And it was at that point, particularly while exploring the English countryside, that Olmsted was working out what overarching landscape design concepts he thought best to apply to American soil. And by doing so, to enhance the public park experience for everyone, not just the wealthy elite. In fact, Olmsted was particularly inspired by England's very first public park, Birkenhead Park, just across the River Mersey from Liverpool, designed by Joseph Paxton. In fact, Olmsted would be so moved by some of the design elements in this plan for Birkenhead that I like to say that he liberally borrowed them, Americanized them, and Olmstedized them for the plan that he would subsequently produce for Central Park with Calvert Vaux. But this period, by the way, marked the beginning of Olmsted's publishing career. And one could say that Olmsted's career as a writer and his immersion into the English naturalistic gardening tradition began during his residency on Staten Island. Now, in 1855, Olmsted becomes partner in the firm that publishes the popular Putnam's Monthly magazine. However, that business fails in 1857. Also, while living in Staten Island, Olmsted's journalistic career started when he was hired by the early iteration of the New York Times in 1855 as a roaming correspondent in what seemed to be a foreign land, the antebellum South. Olmsted filed reports from the field under the pen name Yeoman, a not uncommon practice at that time, by the way, in American journalism. But that same year, Olmsted's first book coming out of this experience, reporting about the South, A Journey in the Seaboard Slave States, is published. It included interviews with plantation owners, slave masters, and interviews with slaves. As some know, the book incorporated graphic descriptions of the life of enslaved people in the South at this time in American history. The brothers then soon took off together yet again to explore the vast Texas territory, much of the time, in fact, on horseback, and the final touches to the Olmsted literary endeavor, bringing much needed publishing notoriety and setting the stage for Olmsted's next achievement, which would be Central Park. John Hull Olmsted and his family, including the young John Charles Olmsted, I have to tell you, took one last trip to Southern Europe to enjoy sunnier, warmer winter weather there. He never returned. With his wife and children nearby, he died in Nice, in France. On November 24th, 1857, before his death, John Hull wrote a deathbed note to his elder brother, pleading with Fred, "Don't let Mary suffer while you are alive." Then, of course, this is when Frederick lost his best friend and his traveling companion. 1857 is a momentous year in Olmsted's life. There's a rather complicated series of serendipitous meetings. Suffice it to say that Olmsted had many powerful friends in horticulture, including Andrew Jackson Downing, also in the literary world and in politics. He is appointed first superintendent of Central Park. That it is after that he and Calvert Vaux collaborate on the winning design for their park called Greensward. And with that success, Olmsted is appointed architect-in-chief for Central Park in 1850. This is how we often imagine him, looking so debonair with cape and if you will, a Greek fisherman's cap. In 1859, in fact, Frederick fulfills his duty. He marries Mary Cleveland Perkins Olmsted, his brother's widow, and formally adopts her children, raising them as his own. In 1861, Olmsted is appointed General Secretary of the U.S. Sanitary Commission, a Civil War-era national medical relief effort securing aid and supplies for wounded soldiers. More about those chapters in a couple of minutes. After resigning his appointment to the Sanitary Commission, Olmsted is appointed to head up the Yosemite and Mariposa mining estates. Who knew he was running a gold mine in the Sierra Nevada of California? There he is. He moves his entire family to the Sierra Nevada. This is Frederick Law and Mary Olmsted here in the front row, picnicking on horseback. And I believe this is the Mariposa Grove in California, 1864. In fact, this is what Mariposa, California looked like, where the gold mine was situated in 1860. Very roughneck mining town. While there, Olmsted is appointed to a California State Commission. He plays a leadership role in writing the first report proposing the permanent protection of Yosemite Valley. More about that report later. Olmsted is reappointed landscape architect for Central Park with Calvert Vaux. He begins work famously on this other magnificent park. You know, everyone in this program, I dare say, knows this. At this point in time, Brooklyn was a separate city competing with Manhattan. They said they wanted one of those Central Park things there too, in the heart of Brooklyn. So Olmsted and Vaux collaborate on this quite extraordinary design for Prospect Park. And at this point, Olmsted and Vaux opened the first office of practicing landscape architecture in the United States on right in downtown Manhattan on Broadway, thus launching a unique career. And I believe it's at this point that Olmsted is extracting himself out of his residency in Staten Island and moving to Manhattan. Now, over the course of his life, and here is, I'm going to just share this with you. I like this, from Tosomock Farm to Olmsted-Beil House Park, before we do leave Staten Island, which I will return to at the very end of the program. And this is taken directly from the Friends of Olmsted-Beil House website. I particularly appreciate the modern sketch juxtaposed with Olmsted's own sketch. Really delightful. Thank you for the Friends of Olmsted-Beil House for posting that. Now, over the course of his life, Olmsted Sr. experienced considerable family tragedy, early deaths of mother, brother, and children, his own near death in a terrible carriage accident in Central Park that left him maimed for life. And he was plagued by a nearly lifelong struggle with dark depression. And facing these and a host of other physical ailments toward the end of his career, fighting infirmities and utter exhaustion, he was still designing the landscape for the 1893 World Columbian Exposition in Chicago and the grounds of the Biltmore Estate, and supervising the creation of these, his final masterpieces. Then, after a few years of waning physical and mental health, he tragically lost his mind. Olmsted passed away in 1903 at the McLean Asylum on the outskirts of Boston, an institution the very grounds of which he had designed. What a story, what a life. Now let's review certain aspects of that career. Perhaps we should say careers, plural, right? His manifold roles of scientific farmer, social reformer, capable administrator, writer, editor, and literary publisher, landscape designer, and last but not least, certainly, master park builder. You could also add sanitary engineer, public health practitioner, proto or early urban planner. Frederick Law Olmsted Sr. was first and foremost a social reformer, and his career was central to the social reform movement of the U.S. during the second half of the 19th century. Olmsted was a philosopher of democracy. He read widely and deeply and wrote thoughtfully about the subject and manifested it in his park designs. I'm going to share two extracts with you about what Olmsted had to say about Central Park. I'm going to put up this picture. Remember, Sheep Meadow was closed during the height of COVID. It reopened finally in the spring of 2021. This is taken directly from that moment. Two comments of Olmsted about Central Park. It is one great purpose of the park to supply to the hundreds of thousands of tired workers who have no opportunity to spend their summers in the country inexpensively, what a month or two in the White Mountains or the Adirondacks is at great cost to those in easier circumstances. In Central Park, you will often find all classes largely represented with a common purpose, each individual adding by his mere presence to the pleasure of all others, all helping to the greater happiness of each. You often see vast numbers of persons brought closely together, poor and rich, young and old. As one of our commentators in our film, historian Keith Morgan said, Olmsted intensely believed in democracy and the park as a site for the enactment of democracy. In fact, two comments I want to share with you. One is regarding that prior comment that refers to the wealthy spending time in the Adirondacks. Yes, the wealthy of New York, the well-heeled, who had time, who had the financial means, who had the transportation, they could spend time going away to these lovely retreats in the mountains up north in New York and New England. The common workers of New York could not do that. They had no ability to do that. So Olmsted, in creating Central Park and designing and creating and building Central Park, he wanted to make sure that he could provide to those hard workers easy, next to free access. Those with limited times and means could have a mini Catskill, a mini Adirondack experience right in the heart of the big city. And one could argue, by the way, and there's recent scholarship that supports this, that Central Park was Olmsted's. He started working on it, yes, before the Civil War. He was continuing after the Civil War. He concluded that work well after the Civil War. But that Central Park was Olmsted's response to what he witnessed in the South prior to the Civil War and during the Civil War, and that the great park itself would provide a counterpoint, a welcoming democratic space where anyone could gather regardless of origin or background, that the park itself would point a way to the future for the nation healing post-Civil War. Though he strayed away from describing himself as what he was indeed, an artist, as is stated by historian Sarah Cedar Miller in our film, Central Park was arguably the most important piece of American art in the 19th century. By the way, a very famous landscape architect, master artist, and Olmsted scholar in his own right, Laurie Olin from Philadelphia, recently argued in the pages of the Wall Street Journal that Central Park, plain and simple, what is the most paramount piece of American art created in any dimension, anywhere in the history of America. He makes that case loud and clear just 2 weeks ago in the pages of the Wall Street Journal. Now, clearly Central Park was a monumental endeavor. An author and Olmsted expert, Elizabeth Barlow Rogers, the founder of the Central Park Conservancy, had this to say about Central Park in our film, quote, "It is a triumph of 19th century engineering, a symphonic sequence of beautiful spaces," unquote. Boy, did Betsy Barlow Rogers totally nail it in that comment. And you can experience the symphonic sequence of beautiful spaces in all of the Olmsted masterworks. This is how I like to capture it. I'm going to put this picture up. Many of you will recognize it. It's Thomas Cole, founder of the Hudson River School, typically referred to as the Oxbow. I think the official title is After a Thunderstorm. This is the painter in the canvas right here on an easel. He's on the top of Mount Holyoke, overlooking an oxbow in the Connecticut River. This is the Connecticut River Valley. I'm not just putting this up as a generic picture of the Hudson River School. To me, it's intimate, it's personal, I know it. I attended college a few miles from here. I lived in a farmhouse about 1.5 miles from here. I've been on the very summit of this mountain many times, taking in the beautiful image of the oxbow below. But what the Hudson River School painters were doing with pigment and brush on canvas, working in 2 dimensions, Olmsted and initially his key collaborator Vaux were painting, drawing, and sculpting the landscapes of America's great cities to build their master parks, not in 2, not in 3, but in 4 dimensions. What's the 4th dimension here, anyone? I hope many of you are mumbling to yourselves. Time, of course. In Olmsted's own words, "I have all my life been considering distant effects and always sacrificing immediate success and applause to that of the future. In laying out Central Park, we determined to think of no results to be realized in less than 40 years. Now, you don't have to read too much of Olmsted, and he was a prodigious writer, or spend too much time in the master parks to realize that his foresight wasn't just 40 years ahead. It wasn't even, it was 200 years into the future. That's the kind of vision he had. Now, I don't have time to do a deep dive into landscape design theory or landscape history. Let me simply say that as a landscape designer, Olmsted clearly was influenced by those who came before him. Practitioners of garden design, also deep thinkers in the realm of art, such as John Ruskin. But in particular, I do want to mention the great English landscape designers, Capability Brown and Humphrey Repton. We have to give a nod here in the US at the time also to Andrew Jackson Downing, who was so influential in mid-19th century America, particularly up and down the Hudson River Valley. In fact, by the way, if Downing hadn't met a premature death on board a terrible steamboat accident on the Hudson River, he would have been the very likely choice as a designated designer for the future Central Park. Downing's unfortunate death opened up a window of opportunity for Olmsted to enter the picture. And by the way, it was Downing who introduced Olmsted and Vaux to one another. I also want to offer a shorthand. You're often hearing references if you read the literature from this time period or literature day, looking back on that time period in both art and literature and garden design. You'll hear references to the sublime, to the pastoral, and the picturesque. It's hard to recreate the sublime in the heart of a big urban area, right? What's the sublime? Well, I already mentioned it. It's the Adirondacks, it's the Catskills, it's Niagara Falls, it's the White Mountains. In Europe, it's the crags of the English Lake District or the Alps. Well, it's hard to recreate that in the heart of a big city, but you can certainly recreate the pastoral and the picturesque. Rather than describing it in words, I'm just going to demonstrate. Here's the pastoral: sheep meadow, Central Park, large sunlit meadow, fringed with trees on the outer edge. Large, beautiful sunlit meadow, great place for people to congregate in numbers if they so choose. This is the north end of Sheep Meadow. An easy walk from the north end of Sheep Meadow takes you into the picturesque, the Ramble. As all of you know, the birding hotspot for Central Park, narrow curvilinear paths, an enclosed woodland environment, a burbling water feature nearby, great place for solitude in nature, or maybe to just be with a close loved one. What a difference. And you see those transitions back and forth between pastoral and picturesque in all, again, of the Olmsted masterworks. Now, as builder of Central Park, Olmsted successfully managed thousands of men in one of the largest construction projects to that point in time in America. During the Civil War, as director of the Sanitary Commission, the forerunner to the Red Cross, Olmsted perfected his management skills while heading up a huge supply medical relief and field hospital operation that included managing a veritable flotilla of hospital ships from the Chesapeake to the Mississippi. Here is the one such hospital ship on the Mississippi. During this period, by the way, Olmsted reorganized the Army Medical Corps. He coordinated contributions and volunteers from local aid societies. By the way, given what we've just been through the last couple of years with COVID and the federal national response, keep in mind that at this point in time, the Sanitary Commission was the largest national public health initiative up to that time in American history. Sanitary fairs like this one in Philadelphia were held in all the major cities of the North. Here is that fair in Philadelphia, and here is one of the women leaders of the day. They were often involved with these sanitary fairs, helping to raise funds. Catherine Prescott Wormley not only did that, she was a nurse in the field. She worked right along Olmsted's side, and in her letters, in great graphic detail, described how absolutely dedicated and driven Olmsted was in the field on this occasion, which applied to his entire career, of course. In fact, she and Olmsted were right there tending to the wounded in the aftermath of at least two of the bloodiest battles of the Civil War, Antietam and Gettysburg. Here is the USSC hospital set up at Gettysburg. Now, let's talk about his writings for a minute. As to his early writings, well, you already heard about Walks and Talks of an American Farmer in England and his writings that ended up in volumes for coming out of his work for the New York Times. Let's return to that. His 3 volumes, here he is as writer, editor, and publisher, and he was a literary publisher for a few years as well. His 3 volumes, The South, the Plains, Texas, Kansas, etc., were all eventually, they had a lasting impact. They're still in print, but they were consolidated into a later version of the work, reissued with a new editorial tone by Olmsted, the title of which is The Cotton Kingdom. And he even produced a map to correspond with the book. Here is his own map of the Cotton Kingdom. It's still widely available. You can buy an edition today. It had a huge impact on intelligentsia, by the way. When the book was published in England, it helped sway British public opinion away from supporting the Confederacy. It swayed British public opinion away from the Confederacy and toward the Union side at the outset of the Civil War. And it is cited by none other than Charles Darwin as influential as he was struggling with the concept of race while he was preparing The Origin of Species for publication. He read Olmsted's writings on slavery, on the Cotton Kingdom, from the Cotton Kingdom. We still struggle with that concept of race today, don't we? And Olmsted contributed to that conversation back in the 19th century. Now, in addition to his stint as publisher and co-editor for Putnam's Monthly, Olmsted co-founded The Nation magazine, not so well known. He co-founded it, and he played a key role as editor of that publication in its early years. And during this relatively brief period in his career, he befriended and published some of the more prominent writers and intellects of the day. I don't have these labeled intentionally. We're going to identify them. You're going to identify them yourselves, I hope, at home. We're going to go clockwise. Who is this individual? That's Ralph, starting top, upper left. That's Ralph Waldo Emerson. In fact, Olmsted was particularly influenced by Emerson's essay on nature. Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, Herman Melville, Harriet Beecher Stowe, they were all part of his circle. Olmsted edited and published them. You could add any number of other writers to that list, including Washington Irving, by the way. Additionally, Olmsted had contact with, if you will, the next generation, the second generation of the Hudson River School painters, including notably his distant cousin from Hartford, Frederick Edwin Church. This isn't a canvas, this isn't Church himself, of course. This is a famous canvas of Niagara Falls, painted by Church. There's a reason why I show that. We'll return to Niagara Falls a little later. And so you get the point between Putnam's Monthly and the Nation magazine and his ties to the cultural leadership of the day. His contacts were a veritable who's who of the arts and letters of America during this era. And to that list can be found many of the leading social reformers of the day throughout New England and New York. One note, we tried in our film to give some due credit to Calvert Vaux, Olmsted's partner. The man who brought Olmsted into the actual design of Central Park also subsequently convinced Olmsted to return to park building once Prospect Park was in the offing. Poor Vaux, the sometimes neglected, lesser-known partner, at least to the general public, but a great architect in his own right, yet a man that time seems to have passed over. It's important to understand the origins of the public park movement in North America at the time. In the highly polluted cities of the 19th century, the trees, shrubs, and lawns in the parks served famously as the lungs of the city, creating refuges of fresh air. Park advocates argued that parks provided refined imitations of nature, claiming that exposure to them would improve people's character regardless of their socioeconomic status. Architect and landscape designer Andrew Jackson Downing himself wrote this in 1848. Quote, "Parks will be better preachers of temperance than temperance societies, better refiners of national manners than dancing schools, and better promoters of general good feeling than any lectures on the philosophy of happiness," unquote. I don't know about you, but I think that stands the test of time. Their sentiments like this were reflecting the influence of the Romantics on the New World's attitudes towards nature. Now, nature wasn't something to be feared, of course, but it was something that people could return to for restoration and healing. Downing and Olmsted brought their own independent experiences of touring European gardens to the US, further emphasizing the beneficial relationship between humans and nature and democratizing the public park experience. By the way, before Central Park, there was but one place that urban New Yorkers could go, if you will, to recreate. Here, this is it. Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn. Most of you know this. It's not far from a portion of Prospect Park, still there today, still absolutely beautiful. But it wasn't the common workers of New York who were perambulating there on weekends. It was the well-heeled on Sunday after church in their Sunday finest, in carriage rides and perambulating as pedestrians around these bucolic lanes of the Greenwood Cemetery. The workers had no place to go. Olmsted was adamant that Central Park serve everyone, regardless of skin color, family origin, or economic status. And I should emphasize here that parks were absolutely seen as instruments for public health. In the mid-19th century, New York and all cities were still dealing with terrible outbreaks of cholera. In fact, Frederick Law and Mary Olmsted lost their first child due to a cholera outbreak in New York City. Unless I'm mistaken, Olmsted himself did refer to Central Park as a public health institution. Now, there's a longer passage which I'm going to spare you right now, but in essence, in this passage from that Olmsted and Vaux used to support their argument for Central Park in 1868, they basically argued for the benefits of what could be called forest bathing. They didn't use that term back then, but I make the argument that Olmsted and Vaux, and you could add certainly Henry David Thoreau to this list, presumably John Muir too, way out in California, they were the earliest proponents of forest bathing, a concept that in fact originated in Japan, much in vogue at this time, including being implemented at various Olmsted parks around the country, it seems to, from what I've noticed. I wonder, I have to say, folks, what Olmsted, a little bit of an aside for you, I wonder what Olmsted would think if he were with us at this time, to see so many people wandering around in a park-like environment with funny little protuberances jutting out of their ears, completely listening to their own internal soundtrack, completely oblivious of the sounds of the natural world, or even worse, like this trio on a park bench in Brooklyn. They're nameless, I don't know who they are, not to pick on them, and I'm pointing the finger at all of us, and that includes me. I wonder what Olmsted would think to see this kind of scenario with these. They're entranced by their shimmering screens. Now, they may be solving the problems of the world, but you know what they're doing. They're paying attention to their social media feeds, and they are oblivious of the natural world that surrounds them. I wonder what Olmsted would think. I dare say he would be frowning. Well, enough commentary for me. Now, our film zooms in on the stories of Central Park, Prospect Park, Buffalo, and Boston's Emerald Necklace. A few comments about those sites before I move on to other parks and other members of the family. By the way, Olmsted and Vaux both considered Prospect Park their masterpiece. For one, they weren't hemmed in by a rectangular area as they were at Central Park. They didn't encounter nearly the same level of political or fiscal interference as they did at Central Park, so well told in our film. Plus, they didn't need to make as many compromises with their initial design as they did at Central Park. So they considered it their masterpiece. By the way, I have to show you this picture. I hope I have it here for you. When I first entered Endale Arch, yes, I do. This is what it looked like above. This is what it looked like, I think, until about 2 years ago, unless I'm mistaken. When this new Endale Arch, or I should say restored Endale Arch, was revealed. Look at the tiger wood paneling, just as Olmsted and Vaux had originally designed and built. This is the restored Endale Arch. Do go, if you haven't been in for a while, I think I'm speaking to the converted, but do go to the Grand Army Plaza entrance, walk through this gorgeous restored Endale Arch to take in the beauty of the Long Meadow. What about Boston, by the way? Well, this is what it looked like. This is the original Back Bay Fens plan, by the way, which predated. It's the beginning. It's the precursor to the Emerald Necklace. It's actually now integrated into the Emerald Necklace, but this is where it started. And here's another overlay of from the Emerald Necklace Conservancy of the Back Bay Fens. But this was, in essence, by the way, they were part of the public sewers for the city of Boston, flowing in and out of the Charles River tidal basin. And this is what it looks like now. And this can be pointed to as the first true wetland restoration project in the history of the United States. I could talk about many of my delightful discoveries in the making of this film. In fact, one was Buffalo. Before beginning research on the film, back in 2007 or so, I hadn't been to Buffalo since I was 6 years old. I had but a dim memory, mostly, of course, of Niagara Falls. But arguably, by the way, the Olmsted, here it is, the Olmsted Park system there in Buffalo is distinctive. It's sui generis. It's the first integrated park system ever designed in America. And it is one of the most intact Olmsted Vaux designs of an integrated park system to this point in time. Look at that. You can see the connected arteries and veins and the traffic circles and the parkways, that is. So you have parks. Here's but two, Delaware Park on the left, Front Park on the right. You have parkways. Here's a historic Lincoln Parkway on the left with equestrian traffic on it, modern day Bidwell Parkway on the right. Look how wide it is. It's not a narrow green strip, it has multiple lanes of trees, multiple rows of trees and multiple paths, plus landscape roads on either side. So it's literally a linear park. It's not just a green strip. And this is what made Buffalo unique, to think of the city as being contained within a giant park or a system of parks, so that anyone, no matter who you were, where you lived, what your family background was, you could be within easy access of a park-like environment by foot, by bicycle, by horseback. And by the way, isn't it interesting? Every park system in America today is still trying to achieve that end for its community. And Olmsted and Vaux were doing that in the late 19th century in Buffalo and elsewhere. By the way, Bidwell Parkway on the right, you only about a mile from Bidwell Parkway takes you to this. This is the Richardson Olmsted complex. Started out life as the Buffalo Insane Asylum. That's architect H.H. Richardson, and landscape architect, of course, Frederick Law Olmsted. It's all been completely restored. You too can take tours, and it's worth, if you're in Buffalo, taking the little side trip to see this rather extraordinary complex assembly of buildings and grounds. Speaking of which, also in Buffalo, I mentioned it before, a stone's throw away, about a 45-minute drive takes you to this. Yes, that's what it looked like, folks. That's Niagara Falls for you in the 19th century. Yep. Now, there were many mill sites. This is but one. There were some semi-natural areas of the waterfall that were available for view, but you had to pay what was called a commutation fee and walk up and over and through a blind in order to get a glimpse of the natural waterfall. The city leaders of Buffalo were so impressed with what Olmsted was doing there. They said, "Mr. Olmsted, what can you do for us?" So he recruited the leading intellects of the day, writers from America and Europe, and leading business leaders and industrialists and philanthropists and opinion makers and thought leaders, if you will, to create the Free Niagara Association, the first national campaign for scenic preservation in the history of the United States. And it was successful. It resulted in unparalleled legislation by the state legislature of New York to create a brand new state reservation, which would become the first state park in the United States, the Niagara Falls State Reservation on the New York side of the waterfall complex. They cleared all the industry out. They did devote other areas to hydropower and other industry away from the falls, but they cleared all the industry out of the immediate area surrounding the falls. And of course, they hired Olmsted and Vaux to design the new state reservation on the New York side. I'm going to focus on this. This is Goat Island. This is their crown jewel, Niagara, Olmsted and Vaux, one of their latter collaborations. And I'm going to zero in on this. You too can go there today. If you haven't been to Niagara Falls, you might also learn that the parkways are being restored. They're removing some of the, how shall I put it, concrete overlay by a certain infamous gentleman, Robert Moses, and creating modern day parkways. They're greening up the site, extraordinary. You can drive or walk across the Goat Island Bridge, but eventually you will have to walk across this bridge to the Three Sisters and go out there to Goat Island, and you are surrounded by the rapids above the waterfalls. And it is a mystical experience, a completely different experience than seeing the waterfalls from the typical vantage points on the New York or Canadian side of the waterfall complex. I highly recommend that you do that if you've never had that experience. Now, I do want to introduce the two sons. Here is John Charles Olmsted, also known as John C. Olmsted, the sequentially nephew, stepson, and business partner of Frederick Law. He learned his father's acute skills of reading the land, understanding soils and vegetation types. He acquired his father's artistic skills as a draftsman and landscape designer. He joined his stepfather's firm in 1875 after graduating from Yale. Upon his father's retirement, he did work with his father on many projects, including the Back Bay Fens in Boston, the Biltmore Estate in Nashville. Then as senior partner in the Olmsted Brothers firm, he led the Essex County, New Jersey project. Here is Branch Brook Park with the cherry trees in full bloom, practically in downtown Newark. What a beautiful park. The first countywide park system in America. In addition to that, John C. Olmsted worked in Atlanta, Louisville, and on Chicago park system projects. He left a huge mark across America, but in particular across the Pacific Northwest where I live, from Victoria, BC to Idaho. He was invited out here, by the way, by the three cities of Portland, Spokane, and Seattle. In essence, they cost shared. None of them could afford him individually. And he took the train out here, and he visited his first visits to the area. He saw views like this, view sheds like this, if you will, at Puget Sound. And view sheds like this, if you will, with Mount Rainier looming behind the city of Seattle. This, of course, is the 1920s. He was here before that, but he wanted to incorporate these kinds of views into his parks that he would eventually design for the city of Seattle. But I do want to point out first how his image changed. This is his appearance. He was the perfectly proper Bostonian when he left Boston by train, traveling by train, crisscrossing America, back and forth multiple times from Boston to the Pacific Northwest, spending more and more time out here. Look what happens. He becomes Sherlock Holmes. This is the style that he cops for his time out here. The only thing missing is the pipe. The interesting thing, folks, is that I also made that move from Boston to the Pacific Northwest, and over time, I too acquired this. This is exactly how I dress every cold, wet winter, which has just started, by the way, and I too even have the pipe. Okay, enough silliness for me again. So this is what John Charles did here in the Pacific Northwest, like father, like son. The father worked on the World Columbian Exposition. Well, this son worked on two major World's Fairs out here, including the 1905 Lewis and Clark Centennial Exposition. He literally designed the entire landscape that put Portland on the national map. He did the same thing a few years later with the AYP Exposition of 1909 in Seattle. Look at this view shed. These are all temporary structures. They're going to come down. It's a World's Fair, but this will remain. This is the Court of Honor. This is the Drumheller Fountain. This is the Rainier Vista. Look at that. It's a somewhat exaggerated view of Mount Rainier in this art card. This becomes, the modern day campus of the UW, the University of Washington. Here's the Court of Honor. Here's the Drumheller Fountain. Here's the Rainier Vista. And way recessed in the distance to the southeast and more accurately depicted in this photograph is Mount Rainier. Thus, the AYP Exposition Grounds becomes the modern day campus for UW. Boy, what work he did in Seattle. Doesn't this remind you of a map I showed you just a little earlier of Buffalo? Look at this complex system of 35 parks and parkways, most of which are still there today. Here is Volunteer Park, perhaps one of the better and more beloved of such parks in Seattle. Here is Green Lake Park today. What a wonderful park. And here's the Washington Park Arboretum, but 3 of the many, many, many sites in Seattle. A whole program could be done about John C. Olmsted just in Seattle, certainly in the Pacific Northwest. Now, in my hometown, this is where I'm speaking to you from today. This is another image of Laurelhurst Park, considered the most perfect Olmsted Park in the city of Portland, another Olmsted master planned system. However, it was his anointed student, if you will, a young practitioner in the Olmsted office in Boston, who Olmsted recommended to the Portland Park Board that they hire as their first park superintendent. So it was Emil Misch, who actually designed the Olmsted Park system of Portland in the Olmsted aesthetic, if you will. But he also recommended to the city fathers of Portland that they protect this vast forested landscape that overlooks the city on the West Hills. Here's a better image that'll help you understand our geography. Willamette River Corridor, St. John's Suspension Bridge. Here's downtown Portland. And this is all forest park, 5,200 acres, the second largest urban forest reserve in the United States. It's riddled with beautiful recreational trails. What an amenity it is for the entire metropolitan area. Has pockets of old growth forest, and it is connected to the wildlife corridor, to the Oregon Coast Range. There are times of the year, particularly in the winter, at the northern edge of this urban forest reserve, away from the city center, where herds of elk, black bear, and even cougar make their way into the outer reaches of the city of Portland, thanks to these wildlife corridors. Quite an accomplishment. Now, it's not all thanks to, entirely can be attributed to John C. Olmsted, but it was in his 1908 report that the city protect and preserve this landscape and don't allow it to be developed. Now, in order to introduce the second son, Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., I have to start with the World Columbian Exposition of 1893, because this was the beginning of the City Beautiful movement in America. The whole idea behind it was to bring together the latest and greatest of the artists of the day, architects, landscape architects, visual artists, incipient early urban planners. Hard to get that phrase out, I apologize. That they would create a unique landscape that would be a sharp contrast with the harsh living conditions of the urban areas of the day, including right there in Chicago. Lake Park in Milwaukee, by the way, is often pointed to as a City Beautiful era park. By the way, that's an entire Olmsted park system there in Milwaukee. Building the City Beautiful, here is the fellow some of you will recognize his name, Daniel Burnham, architect and impresario, big egoed man, famous for this expression, make no little plans, who did assemble, in fact, all of these individuals, including Mr. Olmsted himself. Here is his plan for the World Columbian Exposition, the general plan. And a whole program, of course, could be done about this. And it resulted in the White City of the Chicago World's Fair, all the landscaping, all the design elements, Mr. Olmsted himself and his associates. And of course, you know, like all World Fairs, it's a folly. A utopian fantasy, needless to say, but it did set something in motion, something that became very significant in the 20th century, especially in our nation's capital, the Macmillan Plan for Washington, D.C. So Junior, here he is. This is Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. He was born on Staten Island, by the way. It's important to understand he himself was born on Staten Island, right there, the son of Frederick Law and Mary Cleveland Perkins Olmsted, the widow of Olmsted's brother. And from his earliest years, young Rick Olmsted was aware of his father's fervent desire to have him carry on the family name and profession. The father insisted that this young son become far better educated in botany and horticulture than the father felt himself to be. In the waning years of his life, the father included his young son in the culminating projects of his own career. While still a student at Harvard, young Olmsted spent a summer working in Daniel Burnham's office as the White City of the Chicago of the World Columbian Exposition arose in Chicago. And after graduating Harvard in 1894, he spent a year on site at Biltmore, with the 100,000-acre estate being for George Vanderbilt in Asheville, North Carolina. There's the gardens. Following his father's formal retirement in 1897, he became a full partner with his half-brother, John Charles, in the family business. There is the family business and the family home, known as Fairstead in South Brookline. That's exactly what it looks like today. You too can go there. It is a national park site. You will be greeted by national park rangers. You can take tours. You can see the exhibits, the films. You can tour the beautiful restored gardens. You can tour the drafting rooms just as they looked. And there are vast archives there that you can explore in person or online. And it's a great place to do research. And what a site. And it's very near a portion of the Emerald Necklace. So you can easily combine those two on a Olmsted visit to Boston. Both sons, by the way, Charles and Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. played key roles along with Beatrix Farrand and others in founding the ASLA, the American Society of Landscape Architecture. Jr. also helped establish and taught at the first professional program in landscape architecture in the United States, the Harvard Graduate School of Design. Here he is looking very professorial, of course. And by the way, there at HGSD, as many call it, he influenced generations of landscape architects and urban planners. He emerged on the national scene when this plan came to the forefront. By the way, in 1901, Jr. was appointed to the Commission of Fine Arts for the District of Columbia, more commonly known as the Macmillan Commission. Charged with interpreting for the 20th century Pierre Charles L'Enfant's visions of the nation's capital. Jr. worked with his father's colleagues from the Chicago World's Fair, most of whom were still living, the father had passed, to transform Washington into a work of civic art. And a but partial listing of Jr.'s projects in the nation's capital reads like a guide to Washington, D.C., including the National Mall, including the Jefferson Memorial. I'm going to mention others that I don't have pictures for. Roosevelt now in the National Cathedral grounds. How about the National Zoo? How about the White House grounds here indicated as the executive mansions, and Rock Creek Park and Parkway, all master planned by Jr. and the Olmsted brothers. Speaking of the nation's capital, I want to remind you that Frederick Law Olmsted Sr. also left his mark there. He did extensive landscaping work on the U.S. Capitol grounds, including reorienting the entrance and designing and seeing to the installation of the Capitol steps. I'm going to repeat that once, folks, the Capitol steps. Remember, Olmsted Sr. saw all his public commissions as public spaces where Americans would enact democracy. In August 2015, the National Park Service hosted a special event commemorating the 150th anniversary of this report, Olmsted's historic report, the Yosemite Valley and the Mariposa Grove of Big Trees. That report is, by the way, largely credited with providing the basis for the creation of Yosemite National Park. And its thoughtful wording is considered by the National Park Service to not only be the beginning stage of the creation of what would become Yosemite National Park, but in fact, the preamble, if you will, to the creation of our entire National Park Service. You might remember that the National Park Service itself, in fact, celebrated its 100th anniversary in 2016. In fact, it was Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. who played a key role in writing the language for the Organic Act of 1916, the founding legislation for the U.S. National Park Service, like father, like son. For 30 years, Rick and the Olmsted brothers advised the National Park Service on issues of management and the conservation of scenic resources. And they did landscaping plans and roadway plans and visitor center plans and trail plans for many of these national parks during the mid phase of the 20th century, including at Maine's Acadia National Park and Everglades National Park, Great Smoky Mountains National Park and Yosemite National Park, and elsewhere. You could add Redwoods National Park to that. Now, I've already provided a glimpse into the Olmsted legacy in my region of the country. Where else can we find Olmsted in the American West before we return east? How about Red Rocks Park? That's part of the Denver Mountain Park system. I expect many of you know the Red Rocks Amphitheater, absolutely famous in the musical world. Well, it's right in the heart of Red Rocks Park, which is part of the Denver Mountain Park system, master planned by none other than Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. and the Olmsted brothers. Let's move west to California. Here's Mountain View Cemetery, Oakland. This is an early image. This is Frederick Law Olmsted Sr.'s, if you will, Mount Auburn Cemetery, that's Cambridge, or Greenwood Cemetery, Brooklyn. This is the historic early cemetery for the San Francisco Bay Area, with many notable Californians interred here. This is what it looks like today. You too can roam its beautiful landscaped grounds, all designed by Frederick Law Olmsted Sr., looking over the city of Oakland, the bay, and that big city across the bay in the background. That's all Senior. Senior also worked on this. This is Stanford University. That's the final architectural plan. It was a contentious relationship between Leland Stanford, client, and Frederick Law Olmsted, architect, designer. The two of them worked together on the architectural plan for both buildings and grounds, I'll have you know. And as is often the case, Olmsted suggested something a little more modest, and Leland Stanford had something more grand in mind, and Stanford won out in many instances when it comes to the architecture, but the landscape architecture was still Olmsted, and it does hold together as a plan of some considerable cohesive brilliance, if you will. Here is a few images of that landscape. There's the Stanford Chapel. The Hoover Tower, by the way, came later. And here is an aerial view of the most of the campus, the heart of the campus. You can see how it's it just is very cohesive, both architecture and landscape design, and it's stellar. It's, you know, held out as rather unique among most university campuses in America, including those in the West. What else in California? Well, the brothers came back in the late 20s, early 30s, and they looked at those Berkeley Hills, and the city leader said, "Mr. Olmsted Jr., Rick, what can you do to help us protect those landscapes?" Well, he helped create the major metropolitan regional park system for the area. Here's one of the early historic parks. It is the earliest historic park, Tilden Regional Park. That's East Bay Regional Park District. Here's Franklin Ridge. It was added subsequently. Here it is, 65 parks. What an amazing park system, extending far north, south, and east of those famous East Bay Hills. The East Bay Regional Park District map, all master planned by Junior. He did the same thing for the California State Park System twice over. 125 state parks, by the way, master planned by the Olmsted brothers. And in their report to the state, they recommended protecting additional landscapes that had yet to be protected, including redwoods in the Santa Cruz Mountains. All there now in several state parks, which you've heard of because many of them have been badly damaged, these redwoods, in recent years by the wildfires that have ravaged through the Santa Cruz Mountains. But they're all protected. They're all mostly protected in state parks. They also said, you got to protect this desert, folks. It is now the largest state park in the entire state of California. There's the Anza Borrego Desert in bloom, south of Palm Springs and Palm Desert and all of that. And Palos Verdes. This is perhaps the most complicated residential project that any of the Olmsteds ever worked on, a very huge project, a very complicated deal, transforming the lime shale soils into something suitable for residents and parkland. It involved a big team of people working on it for years. In fact, Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. and his leading assistant, James Dawson, moved their families to Palos Verdes during the interim while they were working on this project. It did result in this. Here it is, Palos Verdes, California. It is not a gated community, but it certainly is a well-heeled community. But here, look at this. It also includes acres and acres of parkland and trails open to the general public of LA and visitors alike. Quite an extraordinary project. And I mention that because we're going to go back east now. Here is Riverside, Illinois. Can't spend too much time on it, but this was master planned by the senior. Again, one of the first such master planned green garden suburbs in the United States, just about 15 miles due east of Chicago. The junior did the same thing on the spine of the East Coast. Many of you will know this, Forest Hills Gardens in Queens, all master planned by Junior. Of course, famous for its annual tennis tournament, which was much in the news this year. But there's Forest Hills Gardens in Queens, still extant. Some of you have been there. Maybe we have guests who live there. I don't know. Here's Roland Park in Baltimore, designed along similar lines. And here is Mountain Lake Estates in Lake Wales in the Central Highlands of Florida. Yes, there are Central Highlands of Florida. I've been there. I can attest to this. What's this? That tower, that's what this is. Bach Tower Gardens. That's the singing tower of the carillon at Bach Tower Gardens. Oh my goodness, you can tell from this picture. What a botanical garden paradise. It is the crown jewel of botanical gardens in Junior's career. And if you're ever within an hour or two's drive of that area of Florida, you must make a beeline to see Bach Tower Gardens. It is extraordinary. Now, oh, what do you know? Now we're going to do a tour of New York State and some surrounding areas. We're going to talk about senior and mostly senior, but I'll also show you some sites that the brothers worked on. Highland Park in Rochester. Guess what? An entire park system in Rochester, modeled after the one in Buffalo. Not as many parks, not as many parkways, but here's Highland Park. Here's Genesee Valley Park and Seneca Park, both in Rochester, absolutely beautiful. How about an entire Olmsted Brothers park system? That's right, an entire Olmsted Brothers park system in Utica, not so well known. This is perhaps the largest and nicest of them all, Roscoe Conklin Park. How about your state capitol in Albany? Building designed in the Romanesque style by none other than H.H. Richardson. Landscape, garden, complex, campus grounds by, of course, Frederick Law Olmsted Sr., another one of their famous collaborations. Downing Park in Newburgh, a late in career collaboration between Vaux and Olmsted Sr. in memory of their late mentor, Andrew Jackson Downing, who lived in Newburgh. And by the way, Vaux Downing also worked on this, and that was Downing's son, named after Calvert Vaux. Now we're going to go to New York City. Guess what? Union Square. Most people aren't aware of this, but that's another Olmsted and Vaux design. Now, unless I'm mistaken, it predated Olmsted and Vaux, but they came in and made some considerable improvements to it and put their stamp on it. There's even a plaque there in Union Square, right where the farmers market is, that commemorates their collaboration here at Union Square. Morningside Park, that's Olmsted Sr. By the way, he worked on Morningside Park when he was in Staten Island. Riverside Park, unless I'm mistaken, he also worked on this when he was at Staten Island. I know for a fact he worked on Morningside Park at that time. How about Fort Tryon Park? This is actually Olmsted Brothers. They did this for the Rockefellers. Well, the land was acquired from the Rockefellers. They donated it, and the Olmsted Brothers made improvements and helped transform it into a beautiful park, as many of you know. Fort Greene Park, that's Olmsted Sr. in Brooklyn. The New York Botanical Gardens. Actually, Vaux did some work on this site, but the Olmsted Brothers came in later and made improvements to it in the early 20th century. So there's an Olmsted Brothers overlay, if you will, at the New York Botanical Gardens. Seaside Park, and we're going to go to Connecticut briefly, just for this one site, because there's a significant Olmsted element there in Greater Bridgeport. There's a number of parks, I have to tell you, in Greater Bridgeport and in that general area of Connecticut, all designed by Olmsted Sr., including most notably Seaside Park in Bridgeport. There's, by the way, much more to speak about in Connecticut, but we can't linger there. We're going to go all the way back to that Essex County, New Jersey park system. There is the Olmsted Brothers plan. Oh, this is the new map, dated 2019, but it is based on the Olmsted Brothers plan. And here is Branch Brook Park in Newark yet again, and Parkway. And there is the centerpiece of that park right in downtown Newark, by the way. And you too can go see this. It's one of only, unless I'm mistaken, 3 actual sculptures of Mr. Olmsted, either busts or complete sculptures anywhere in America. There's 3, maybe 4 that I know of that have been documented. Only one built in recent years. This is a lovely one, though, I have to tell you, right there in the heart of Branch Brook Park. Elsewhere in that same park system, Wequahic Park in Newark, part of the Essex County Park System. Same thing here, South Mountain Reservation in West Orange. Same thing here, the 1903 Olmsted Brothers plan for Anderson Park. I think it's a polished jewel. It's absolutely beautiful. It's in Montclair. This is my picture I took from a visit there this past May. What a beautiful park Anderson Park is. How about Warnoco Park in Roselle? Also an Olmsted Brothers Park System, John C. Olmsted. And let's mark some senior accomplishments right there in New Jersey. We're going to go all the way south of Princeton to Lawrenceville Township. The Olmsted firm, father and sons, worked on university campuses, as you already know, but also private schools across America. This is on the Lawrenceville School is often pointed to as the most perfect private school campus of its kind. And this is Olmsted Sr., by the way, right there in Lawrence Township, New Jersey. Finally, Cadwallader Park. It's in Trenton. I have to tell you, it's not in particularly good shape. I have visited a couple of times in the last couple of years, but it does have this beautiful interpretive sign that I think is extraordinarily well done. And it could use a little love, but that's actually the only Olmsted Sr. public park in the entire state of New Jersey. There's plenty of Olmsted Brothers parks, but that's the only Olmsted Sr. park in New Jersey. We're going to quickly go to Long Island, then bring this to a close, back to Staten Island. Here's Planting Fields Arboretum, where I just was literally a week ago, Oyster Bay, Long Island. This is Olmsted Brothers. There's a long story here. What an estate's park. It's on the Gold Coast, but it's a state historic park, by the way. I'm only showing these because they're open to the public. They're state historic parks. They're not private estates that you have to pay a mint to get into, or that are maybe not even open to the public. These are nearly free access state historic parks open to the public, very low cost entry. Here's the Italian Garden and Pool Planting Fields. This is Olmsted Brothers. Now there is a clear Olmstedian vista How do you like that? But that's on the North Shore. On the South Shore, Bayard Cutting Arboretum. Unless mistaken, it's Great River is officially the town that it's in Long Island. It's kind of in an isolated little rural part of the central South Shore. But this is senior. This is senior, Olmsted Senior. There on Long Island. Here are a couple of images. That's the modern day photograph of the right of a restored walkway along the river's edge. There is a river there along the river's edge. I love the artwork on the left. And here is another final passing picture of Bayard Cutting Arboretum. Finally, what's this? Here's another image. Gives a good feel for the status of the house right now, but I wanted to at least show the fact that you have, thanks to Friends of Olmsted-Beil House, we do have a wonderful Olmsted-Beil House Park signage in place. And this is marvelous on the website. I highly encourage you, if you haven't done so, go to the Friends of Olmsted-Beil House website to explore the discovery map of Frederick Law Olmsted on Staten Island. And what an accomplishment this summer, taken directly from the Friends of Olmsted-Beil House website, by the way. This is from August 26, 2022, just this summer, when they had a ceremony to co-name the Woods of Arton Road as Frederick Law Olmsted Way. Congratulations to Friends of Olmsted-Beil House for this notable accomplishment. I believe I see Mr. Bell himself right there in the photograph holding up the sign of Frederick Law Olmsted Way on the upper left. So let me bring this to a close. You're wondering, when am I ever going to close this program, this verbose program, right? Well, we're finally there, folks. You know, it's important to understand that during this past couple of years of COVID quarantine and social distancing, it's important to understand that public parks have been a lifesaver for so many of us seeking fresh air, exercise, physical and psychological health. Frederick Law Olmsted emphasized public health, mental health, and taking it even further, the spiritual health benefits of the public park experience for everyone in a democracy. So as we commemorate Olmsted Senior's birthday and the Olmsted Design Landscapes legacy during this year of 2022 and beyond, we also highlight the ever more crucial role that the public park experience plays in our lives. Needless to say, COVID and social and environmental justice movements have only greatly underlined that very fact, and the urgent need to provide more green space, to distribute it equitably, and to make all such spaces accessible and inviting to all. It isn't too much of a stretch to say that that was Frederick Law Olmsted's agenda from the very start. Now closing. I'm going to leave you with two thoughts, two quotes, as you appreciate the John Singer Sargent portrait of Frederick Law Olmsted that hangs prominently at Biltmore. When all the artists and architects were gathered in Chicago for a banquet prior to the cutting of the ribbon to open up the World Columbian Exposition, they were all there to laud Daniel Burnham for his achievement, the driving force, of course, for that whole endeavor. He pivoted in this instance. He pivoted, if you will. He deflected some of that applause, and he said this about his collaborator, quote, "Each of you knows the name and genius of him who stands first in the heart and confidence of American artists, the creator of your own parks. He who it is who has been our best advisor and constant mentor, Frederick Law Olmsted. An artist, he paints with lakes and wooded slopes, with lawns and banks and forest-covered hills, with mountainsides and ocean views. He should stand where I do tonight, not for the deeds of later years alone, but for what his brain hath wrought and his pen has taught for half a century." Finally, we'll let Mr. Olmsted himself conclude this program. Isn't this a great picture? It's from the Boston Globe. "The beauty of the park should be in the beauty of the fields, the meadow, the prairie, of the green pastures and the still waters. What we want to gain is tranquility and rest to the mind. Is it doubtful that it does men good to come together this way, in pure air and under the light of heaven? Frederick Law Olmsted." Seems to me that that prescription, if you will, rings as loud today in 2022 as it did in the late 19th century. Thank you, Frederick Law Olmsted and Sons, and thanks to all of you for your time and attention today. Thanks for hosting me at this program today. Much appreciated. I'm happy to take questions and answers. I'm going to flash by some things very quickly and just get to a couple of pages I'm going to leave up at the end. I'm going to be a resource list will be provided to all of you. These are some of my favorite recent books about Olmsted. Here is Olmsted 200, How to Stay in Touch. Here is the URL for our film, which I think is posted now in the chat, because there's more to see on this dedicated proprietary website than you would randomly see by searching for it on PBS or Amazon or YouTube. Here are some of my sources and resources, including, of course, Friends of Olmsted-Beil House, olmstedbeilhouse.org. And this is how you can contact me. And it's been a pleasure, everyone. I'm happy to take questions and answers. Thanks for bearing with me on this awfully long program in your Saturday afternoon.
Well, Laurence, thank you so much for that incredible presentation. And I've been taking copious notes throughout for many different Olmsted parks that I want to add to my future travels. But we did have some questions that we wanted to get to in the last couple of minutes. One thing was Jeff mentioned, since you gave us a little tour around New Jersey, was also the Union County Park system. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but maybe you could comment a little bit about that. And the Olmsted brothers work on that in the 1920s, I believe.
Yes, well, it's only, I actually had more. If I were presenting this in New Jersey, believe me, I would have covered Union County. But Essex County is first and foremost and paramount. But right after doing the Essex County system, he did an entire, John C. Olmsted, another entire county park system in Union County just next door. And I'm actually forgetting now one of the more, there's a park in Roselle, Jeff will probably know. It's in Roselle, New Jersey. I think that's the name of the community. But there's again, there is an entire park system there, and I just couldn't take the time to feature it just now. I wanted to focus on mostly the Essex County parks.
Of course, and he mentioned High Point State Park as well.
Okay, thanks, Jeff.
I also mentioned that we have someone from Warren Anco was the park that you're trying to think of.
Yes, Warren-Oco. Yep. Warren-Oco and New Roselle, right?
Yeah. And I know we do have some representatives from Buffalo as well who are on the program, and so they appreciate your deep conversation about that, because it's extremely important in the history of American landscape architecture and often overlooked. Bill had a question, since you mentioned the Biltmore and the connection between Olmsted and the Vanderbilts. Could you comment a little bit about the early days of that relationship as it developed on Staten Island? I think that's an important sort of part of Olmsted's, since we look at the Olmsted-Beil House on Tosomock Farm as sort of this nascent, this place, the sort of nascent development of Olmsted's ideas about landscape architecture. Could you talk a little bit about that relationship with the Vanderbilts early on?
Actually, I might even defer to Bill on this, Bill, because I'm actually forgetting some of the details and which member of the Vanderbilt family it was. It wasn't George Vanderbilt, who he ended up doing the work for at Biltmore, that he first interacted with in New York City. But there's Vanderbilt. Vanderbilts were resident on Staten Island, and I know there's a Vanderbilt Landing. Is it still called Vanderbilt Landing today? But there was a Vanderbilt Landing for the ferry. And this is where Olmsted first established a relationship with the Vanderbilt family, which would blossom because he worked on several different Vanderbilt estates around America, most notably, of course, Biltmore, which was George Vanderbilt, the great grandson, unless mistaken, of the Commodore. Bill, do you want to help us help elucidate that in terms of the friendships with the Vanderbilts on Staten Island?
I'm probably not the best expert on this. Perhaps Maureen Marlowe, who's also on the program, could help me here. But I do know that he met the Vanderbilts when he was at Tosomock Farm, because they were neighbors. I mean, not next door neighbors like we think of them, but in the same, general area of Staten Island. And he designed the mausoleum for the Vanderbilts. It's still on Staten Island. And that was one of the earliest connections. I'm not sure which member of the family that was, but he was actively involved in and met them early in his life there. So it was a relationship that endured, I would say.
I think the member of the family that he first established a friendship with there is William Vanderbilt, but I might be misremembering. And boy, the Vanderbilt family has so many generations and so many branches. It's actually sometimes too hard to get a handle on this unless you actually have an image of the family tree up there in front of you.
Giuseppe, I'll give him a shout out because he is the designer of that map that you showed created by Friends of Olmsted-Beil House. He says, yes, it's William Vanderbilt.
Thank you. Thank you, Giuseppe.
Mhm.
For, yeah. And thanks, Bill. What it gives us all reason to refresh our memory by maybe reading those chapters of the biographies that touch on this, or other information that's available.
Well, I'm going to turn to another question from Bill here, because I think it's a great one, and especially since you ended your presentation talking about the enduring influence of Olmsted today. Are there any people that you can point to or think of in landscape design or park design and management who you think carry on the legacy of Olmsted, or is this just something that's so pervasive across the field because he was so influential?
Well, that's a two-part question.
Yeah.
Or if not three parts, and it's not infrequent that I get that question, and I do have an answer. Firstly, in the mid 20th century, many landscape architects ran away from Olmsted and the Olmsted influence. But whether they admit it or not, all practicing landscape architecture today are inevitably influenced by it, because it's in the ether, it's in the osmosis. They absorbed it when they were students. They absorbed it when they were looking at landscapes across America. And whether they acknowledge it or not is beside the point. They've been influenced. Now, there's one leading landscape architect I'm going to mention by name, and then there's a park site that I'm going to mention by name. They're not connected with one another. But let's talk about individuals first. That would be Laurie Olin of Olin Studios in Philadelphia. I just had the pleasure and honor of spending a little more time with Laurie just a week ago at Planting Fields on Long Island. He was one of the presenters at a symposium. Laurie is well known for re-landscaping the Washington Monument. He and his firm have worked on countless small and large public and private projects. He does prefer, I think, mostly public projects across America. If you go to his website, you will see all of the projects that they've worked on over time. But he himself is an out-and-out Olmsted scholar. He is erudite and absolutely fundamentally influenced by the Olmsteds. He acknowledges it. And he, they really are his early inspiration as the entry point to his career in the field of landscape design. He also is very much a practicing modernist, using contemporary materials and methods. But unquestionably, he's been deeply influenced by the Olmsted design aesthetic and philosophy. In terms of parks, and I'd have to look up quickly the name of the team that did the work, but in the outskirts, Louisville has a wonderful park system, as I hinted at earlier, an Olmsted senior park system. It's right up there with Buffalo and Boston and Rochester, and of course, the two master parks of New York. But there's a modern day park system on the outskirts of Louisville, much further away from the urban area, but now at the edge of suburban development. So they built it there by design because they knew the city would eventually grow out to this area, and it's perfect. Luckily, there was some wealth involved, so it's a public-private partnership. But if you look up 21st century parks and the parklands of Floyd's Fork, which is a sinuous, linear parkland designed along a creek bed, much of which is navigable by small paddlecraft. It is an extraordinary assembly of parks and trails and protected woodlands and creekside space and ravines and meadows, with a whole assembly of modern day additions such as playgrounds and a variety of playscapes for children and so forth. But it's designed totally, it's inspired at the get-go by the Olmsted principles. At the get-go, it's seen to be, it was designed as a modern day 21st century Olmsted park system for the outskirts of Louisville, inspired by the original Olmsted landscapes there in Louisville. And the individuals, David Jones, who he's now deceased, but the former president of Humana, this was his retirement project, if you will. He sunk some of his own individual funds into this, but his son runs it, and that's Dan Jones. I have to give Dan Jones some credit. Dan Jones has a PhD in history. He went off as an adult to the Yale School of Forestry to earn a forestry degree. And then he came back to actually create this park system and run this park system with a team of landscape architects. It's totally inspired by Olmsted. And if you go to Louisville's a great town anyway for a whole bunch of reasons. And if you're there and you're exploring the Olmsted parks, just go take the half-hour drive to the outskirts. I think it's South Broadly, 45 minutes, and you're in this extraordinary Parklands of Floyd's Fork landscape.
Great,
Yep.
amazing.
Yep.
Thank you for sharing that. And I'll also
Yep.
give a little plug for Olin Studio, because they recently designed in the last couple of years Pier 26 on Hudson River Park, which is
Thank you.
really beautiful and has this wonderful recreated salt marsh on the pier as well. So that's a really cool modern park in the local area as well.
Thanks for that reminder, Andrew.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we're just about out of time. So I want to thank everybody so much for joining us, and give a special thanks to Bill for introducing us, everybody at the Friends of Olmsted-Beil House, and of course, Laurence, for that incredible presentation. All of these resources you see on the screen, we're going to share with you. So we'll send a follow-up email. You can also find them, many of them on the webpage where you signed up for this, and also find them on the Friends website as well. But I'll give the final word to you, Laurence, and to you, Bill, if there's anything you want to add before we sign off.
Oh, I think I've said my piece. Thank you, everyone. It's been a pleasure and an honor to join all of you today. Thank you.
And I would just add thanks to everybody for joining us, and to Laurence for an encyclopedic overview and intense examination of the career and legacy of Frederick Law Olmsted. I'd also like to mention Maureen Marlowe, who, along with me, was instrumental in putting this program together. Another member of the board of the Friends of Olmsted-Beil House, and it was largely through her efforts that we got this off the ground. So shout out to her as well.
And a final shout out to Friends of Olmsted-Beil House for your mission and for the dedication of you and your team there, Bill. Thank you for everything you're doing to preserve that very important historic site.
Got a good group working on it.
Yeah, you do indeed.